9-year-old girl refuses to return to school, claiming her male teacher does terrible things to her. Suspicious, her father places a camera in her backpack and discovers something terrible. The late August sun beat down on Westbrook, Massachusetts, as Lucy Blackwood stared up at her new home. A modest 2-story colonial with fading white paint and dark green shutters. At 9 years old, she'd already traveled halfway around the world, leaving behind the familiar streets of Melbourne for this quiet suburban town that felt more like a movie set than a real place. "What do you reckon, sweetheart?" Jack Blackwood's deep voice carried the thick Australian accent that had already drawn curious looks from their neighbors. He stood beside the moving truck, his broad shoulders and military posture making him seem even taller than his 6'2" frame. Lucy adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and tried to sound optimistic. "It's different from home." Jack's weathered face softened as he watched his daughter. At 42, his dark hair had begun graying at the temples, and fine lines marked the corners of his eyes, souvenirs from 15 years in the Royal Australian Navy. "Give it time, love. Different doesn't mean bad." They spent the afternoon unpacking boxes, their voices echoing through empty rooms that smelled of fresh paint and new carpet. Lucy's bedroom was smaller than her old one, but it had a window seat overlooking the backyard's ancient oak tree. She carefully arranged her books on the built-in shelves, worn copies of Australian classics her mother had given her, alongside newer American novels she'd bought to help her fit in. "Mum would have loved this window seat," Lucy said quietly, running her hand along the cushioned surface. "She always wanted one for reading." Jack paused in the doorway, a box marked Lucy winter clothes in his arms. 3 years had passed since cancer took Sarah, but moments like these still caught him off guard. "Yeah, she would have. Probably would have fought you for it too." Lucy managed a small smile, remembering her mother's reading habits. "She'd have let me share." Sometimes, as evening approached, they sat on the floor of their empty living room, eating takeaway pizza, their first American dinner in their new American home. Lucy picked at her pepperoni, her appetite diminished by the knot of anxiety growing in her stomach. "Dad," she said, setting down her half-eaten slice, "what if they don't understand me at school? What if they think I talk funny?" Jack wiped his hands on a paper napkin, considering his response. "They might, at first. People here aren't used to our accent. But you know what? That makes you special. Different. And there's nothing wrong with that." "I don't want to be different," Lucy muttered, hugging her knees to her chest. "I want to be normal." "Normal's overrated, love. Besides, you've got your mother's spirit in you. Remember what she always said about being yourself." Lucy nodded, reciting the familiar words. "Better to be different and real than normal and fake." "Exactly." Jack reached over to tuck a strand of dark hair behind her ear. "And you've got me in your corner. Always will." Later that night, after Lucy had gone to bed, Jack sat in his study unpacking his own boxes. He carefully arranged his service medals and photographs on the desk, memories of his naval career that seemed a lifetime ago. The security consulting job in Boston had been a lucky break, a chance to give Lucy a fresh start after losing her mother. He picked up a family photo taken at St. Kilda Beach, Sarah's smile radiant despite the illness that had already begun to claim her. "I'll take care of our girl," he whispered to the photograph. "Whatever it takes." The next morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect New England late summer day. Lucy stood before her mirror, tugging at her new school uniform, navy blazer, gray skirt, white button-up shirt. The Westbrook Middle School crest felt foreign on her chest. "Ready for battle, soldier?" Jack asked from her doorway, attempting to lighten the mood. Lucy straightened her shoulders, mimicking his military bearing. "Ready as I'll ever be, sir." The drive to school was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. Westbrook Middle School rose before them, a sprawling brick building with white columns that seemed to Lucy both grand and intimidating. Students streamed up the wide front steps, their American voices carrying across the parking lot. Jack pulled up to the drop-off zone and turned to his daughter. "Remember what we talked about? Head high, shoulders back. Like a proper sailor's daughter," Lucy finished, their old family joke bringing a brief smile to her face. That's my girl. He watched her gather her backpack, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he couldn't protect her from everything that lay ahead. I love you, sweetheart. Love you too, Dad. Lucy stepped out of the car, adjusting her glasses one last time. As she walked toward the school entrance, Jack noticed how small she looked among the crowd of American students. Her dark hair, pulled back in a neat ponytail, bounced with each step, and he could see her working to maintain the confident posture they'd practiced. He waited until she disappeared through the heavy front doors before pulling away from the curb. In his rearview mirror, Westbrook Middle School loomed large and imposing, and for the first time since their move, Jack felt a flutter of uncertainty in his chest. He pushed it aside, focusing on the road ahead. They were Blackwoods, survivors, fighters. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. What he couldn't know, as he drove toward his first day at the new job, was how soon and how severely that resolve would be tested. Lucy's first week at Westbrook Middle School passed in a blur of new faces and unfamiliar routines. Initially, her accent drew curious questions and even some friendly interest, but by the second week, the novelty had worn off, replaced by something darker. It started during Mr. Harrison Pierce's American history class. Lucy sat in the third row, trying to make herself inconspicuous as the teacher discussed the American Revolution. "Miss Blackwood," Mr. Pierce called out, his thin lips curving into what might have been a smile. "Perhaps you'd like to share the British perspective on colonial rebellion? Given your background." Lucy felt her cheeks burn as 24 pairs of eyes turned toward her. "I'm Australian, sir. Not British." Yes, Australia." Mr. Pierce leaned against his desk, arms crossed. Another former penal colony that somehow managed to civilize itself. Eventually, several students snickered. "Actually, sir," Lucy began, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "Australia has one of the highest standards of living in the—" "That's enough, Miss Blackwood." Mr. Pierce cut her off sharply. "We're discussing American history, not your homeland's questionable achievements." During lunch period that day, Lucy found a quiet corner in the cafeteria. She was halfway through her sandwich when Travis McCarthy and his friends claimed the table next to hers. Travis was tall for 13, with sandy hair and an athlete's build that already hinted at the football player he'd become. "Hey, Crocodile Dundee," he called out, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Where's your kangaroo?" Lucy kept her eyes on her lunch, but her hands trembled slightly. "I'm trying to eat." "Oh, sorry." Travis's voice dripped with mock concern. "I'm trying to eat," he repeated, exaggerating her accent to more laughter. "Did you hear that, guys? The convict's trying to eat." "I'm not a convict," Lucy muttered, gathering her things to leave. As she stood, Travis's foot shot out, catching her ankle. Lucy stumbled, her lunch tray clattering to the floor. Her sandwich and apple rolled across the tile as laughter erupted around her. "Oops," Travis said innocently. "Guess they don't teach walking in Australia." Lucy fled to the bathroom, fighting back tears. She spent the rest of lunch period there, waiting for the bell to ring, her hunger forgotten. The incidents multiplied over the next few weeks. Her locker was defaced with crude drawings of kangaroos and koalas. Someone began leaving notes, "Go back to Prison Island," and "No convicts wanted." During PE, her gym clothes mysteriously disappeared, only to reappear soaking wet in a toilet. Mr. Pierce's behavior grew more pointed. He seemed to take special pleasure in calling on Lucy when she wasn't raising her hand, then criticizing her answers in front of the class. "Miss Blackwood, your understanding of American civics is about what I'd expect from someone raised in a former penal colony," he announced one day after Lucy stumbled over a question about the Electoral College. "Perhaps you'd benefit from some remedial studies?" One rainy Thursday, things escalated. Lucy was walking to her next class when she felt hands on her back. The push sent her stumbling into a bank of lockers. Pain shot through her shoulder as metal met bone. "Watch where you're going, prison girl," Travis laughed as he passed with his friends. That evening, Lucy examined her shoulder in the bathroom mirror. A purple bruise was already forming, joining others on her arms and legs from similar accidents. She pulled on a long-sleeved shirt before dinner, not wanting her father to notice. But Jack did notice other things. The way Lucy picked at her food. How she'd grown quiet during their evening conversations. The dark circles forming under her eyes. "Everything all right at school?" he asked casually over dinner. "Fine," Lucy replied too quickly, pushing her peas around her plate. "Just adjusting." Jack studied his daughter's face, remembering how Sarah would do the same thing. Try to protect him from worry by keeping things to herself. "You know you can tell me anything, right? If someone's giving you trouble." "I said I'm fine, Dad." Lucy's voice carried an edge he'd never heard before. "May I be excused?" That night, Jack heard muffled crying from Lucy's room. He stood outside her door, hand raised to knock, but ultimately lowered it. She'd talk to him when she was ready, he told himself. She just needed time to adjust. The next morning, Lucy discovered her school bag had been emptied into a trash bin. As she retrieved her books, now stained with coffee grounds and banana peels, Travis and his friends passed by. "Dumpster diving?" Travis called out. "Guess you can take the girl out of the prison colony." Lucy was late to Mr. Pierce's class, her books still damp from the trash. The teacher made her stand in front of the room to explain her tardiness. "My books were..." she started, but her voice faltered under the class's stares. "Articulation, Miss Blackwood," Mr. Pierce said coldly. "Though I suppose proper English is a challenge for some backgrounds. Detention after school for tardiness." That afternoon in detention, Lucy sat alone in Mr. Pierce's classroom, completing a 500-word essay on the importance of punctuality in American education. The teacher graded papers at his desk, occasionally glancing up with what seemed like satisfaction at her isolation. When she finally left school that day, the sun was already setting. Lucy walked home slowly, her shoulder throbbing where it had hit the lockers. She thought about telling her father everything about Travis, about Mr. Pierce, about the bruises she was running out of excuses for. But then she remembered the worry lines that had deepened around his eyes since Mum died. How hard he'd worked to get this job in America. How much he'd sacrificed to give her a fresh start. No, she decided. She would handle this herself. She was a Blackwood, after all. Survivors, fighters. What Lucy couldn't know, as she walked home in the gathering darkness, was that some battles couldn't be fought alone, and that her father's military precision, which had lain dormant since leaving the Navy, would soon find a new and terrible purpose. The breaking point came on a crisp October morning. Lucy had developed a routine of arriving at school early to avoid encounters in the crowded hallways. But this day, as she rounded the corner to her locker, she found Travis and 3 of his friends waiting. "Day, mate," Travis sneered, blocking her path. "Got something special for you today." Lucy tried to step around them, her heart pounding. "Leave me alone." "But we made you a present." One of Travis's friends, Michael, produced a plastic bag filled with dirty water. A little piece of home. Before Lucy could react, they had her cornered. Travis held her arms while Michael dumped the bag over her head. The fetid water soaked through her uniform, and the unmistakable smell of toilet water filled her nostrils. "There," Travis laughed. "Now you smell like the sewer colony you came from." Lucy stood frozen, water dripping from her hair, her glasses spotted with filthy droplets. Students passing by quickened their pace, averting their eyes. No one stopped to help. That's when she made her decision. Still dripping, she marched straight to Principal Sandra Morris's office. The principal's secretary tried to stop her, but Lucy pushed past, leaving wet footprints on the carpet. Principal Morris looked up from her desk, her perfectly maintained appearance contrasting sharply with Lucy's sodden state. "Young lady, what is the meaning of..." "They dumped toilet water on me," Lucy interrupted, her voice shaking. "Travis McCarthy and his friends. They've been bullying me for weeks. Mr. Pierce too. He encourages them. He..." "Slow down." Principal Morris held up a manicured hand. "These are serious accusations. Do you have any proof?" Lucy pulled out her phone. "I started recording things. The way Mr. Pierce treats me in class. The things Travis says. Recording without consent is against school policy. Principal Morris's voice hardened. And Mr. Pierce is one of our most respected teachers. I find it hard to believe he would act inappropriately. But look at me. Lucy gestured to her wet uniform. I'm covered in toilet water. Principal Morris sighed, as if dealing with a particularly tiresome child. Miss Blackwood, adjusting to a new country can be challenging. Perhaps you're being oversensitive to normal teenage interactions. Oversensitive? Lucy's voice cracked. They push me into lockers. They steal my things. I understand you're upset, Principal Morris interrupted. But making unfounded accusations against other students and staff members is very serious. I suggest you focus on adapting to our culture rather than looking for problems where none exist. Lucy stood there, water still dripping onto the expensive carpet, as the full weight of her isolation crashed over her. You're not going to do anything, are you? I'm going to give you a pass to change into your gym clothes, Principal Morris said, already turning back to her computer. And I suggest you delete any unauthorized recordings before they become a disciplinary issue. Lucy walked woodenly to the gym, changed into her spare clothes, and sat through her morning classes in a daze. During history, Mr. Pierce seemed to take special pleasure in calling on her repeatedly, making pointed remarks about her disheveled appearance. That afternoon, she tried one last time to document the abuse. Hidden behind a row of lockers, she recorded Travis and his friends as they harassed another student, a small 7th grader with a speech impediment. She didn't notice Mr. Pierce approaching until he was right behind her. Miss Blackwood, his voice made her jump. Phone. Now. But now. His hand extended expectantly. With trembling fingers, Lucy handed over her phone. She watched helplessly as Mr. Pierce accessed her photos and videos, systematically deleting everything. Unauthorized recording is a serious offense, he said, his voice dripping with false concern. I'm afraid this will mean detention. Every day next week. That's not fair. The words burst out before she could stop them. Mr. Pierce's face hardened. Life isn't fair, Miss Blackwood. The sooner you learn that, the better. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. And if I catch you recording again, you'll learn just how unfair it can be. That evening, Lucy sat at her desk, staring at her homework without seeing it. The words on the page blurred as tears filled her eyes. She heard her father moving around downstairs, preparing dinner, humming an old Australian folk song. She thought about telling him everything. About the toilet water. About Principal Morris's dismissal. About Mr. Pierce's threat. But then she remembered the night before they left Melbourne, when she'd overheard him on the phone with his sister. This job is our chance, Kate. A fresh start for Lucy, after everything with Sarah. She needs this. We both do. Lucy wiped her eyes and pulled out her history textbook. She was a Blackwood. She could handle this. What she didn't know was that her father had already begun to notice things. The missing phone she claimed she'd lost, the way she flinched when he moved too quickly, the haunted look in her eyes that reminded him too much of soldiers he'd known, good men who'd carried burdens too heavy for too long. And Jack Blackwood, former Royal Australian Navy officer, was about to discover that some enemies didn't wear uniforms or carry weapons. Sometimes they stood in front of classrooms or sat behind principals' desks. And sometimes justice needed a helping hand. Late October arrived with a chill that penetrated the Blackwood home. Jack sat in his study, reviewing security contracts but finding himself distracted by the sounds, or rather, the lack of sounds, from Lucy's room. The laughter and music that once filled their Melbourne home had been replaced by a heavy silence. His daughter had changed. The spark in her eyes had dimmed, replaced by dark circles and a wariness that seemed to age her beyond her 9 years. She'd lost weight, her uniform hanging loose on her shrinking frame. That evening, he heard a crash from the upstairs bathroom. "Lucy," he called out, already moving toward the stairs. "Everything all right?" "Fine." Her voice carried a note of panic. "Just dropped something." Jack hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, years of military instinct screaming that something wasn't right. He counted to 30, then climbed the steps silently, his footfalls absorbed by the carpet runner. The bathroom door was slightly ajar. Through the gap, he saw Lucy standing before the mirror, her school shirt pulled up on one side. A massive bruise, dark purple and yellow at the edges, spread across her ribs. As she dabbed at it with a wet cloth, bloody tissues littered the counter, evidence of another nosebleed she'd hidden from him. "Jesus Christ," Jack breathed. Lucy spun around, yanking her shirt down. "Dad, I was just... Don't..." His voice was quiet, controlled, but Lucy recognized the tone. It was the same one he'd used when speaking to the doctors during her mother's final days. "Show me. It's nothing, really. I just show me." Slowly, Lucy raised her shirt again. In the harsh bathroom light, the bruise looked even worse. Other marks, in various stages of healing, dotted her torso and arms. "Who did this?" The question came out as a whisper, but there was steel beneath it. Lucy's composure finally cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks as weeks of pent-up fear and pain poured out. Between sobs, she told him everything about Travis and his friends, about the toilet water, about Principal Morris's dismissal, and about Mr. Pierce. Jack listened, his face growing harder with each revelation. When Lucy described Mr. Pierce's threat after confiscating her phone, something dark flickered in his eyes. "Why didn't you tell me sooner, love?" Lucy wiped her eyes. "You worked so hard to get us here. I didn't want to ruin everything." Jack pulled her into a gentle hug, mindful of her bruises. "Nothing is more important than you." Nothing. That night, after Lucy had finally fallen asleep, Jack sat in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched before him. On his desk lay his service medals, photographs from his naval days, and a small notebook where he'd written down every name Lucy had mentioned. He opened his laptop and began searching. Travis McCarthy's father was a local real estate developer. Michael Chen's mother sat on the school board. Principal Morris had been at Westbrook Middle School for 15 years, collecting accolades and steadily climbing the administrative ladder. And Harrison Pierce lived alone in a small house on Cedar Street, exactly 2.3 miles from the school. Divorced, no children, 20 years of teaching experience, all at Westbrook. Jack pulled up the school's security protocols, architectural plans, and staff schedules, all readily available to him as a security consultant who'd been hired to review the district's emergency procedures. As the night deepened, he methodically filled the notebook with details. Routines, vulnerabilities, patterns. The military precision that had served him in the Navy now turned to a different purpose. In the small hours of the morning, Jack stood at Lucy's doorway, watching her sleep. In the dim light, she looked so much like Sarah. The same dark hair, the same delicate features. Sarah, who'd made him promise to protect their daughter before cancer took her. "I'm sorry, love," he whispered, though Lucy couldn't hear. "I should have seen it sooner. But I see it now." He returned to his study and opened the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside lay a small box he'd brought from Australia, one of the few things he'd kept from his military days. He hadn't opened it since arriving in America, hadn't thought he'd need to. Jack lifted the lid, revealing a set of black gloves, a balaclava, and other tools of his former trade. Equipment for operations that never officially happened, carried out by men who were never officially there. Right then, he murmured, checking each item. "Let's talk about consequences." Jack spent the next week in meticulous observation. His security consulting job provided the perfect cover for his presence around the school, allowing him to map out routines and behaviors with military precision. He sat in his parked car, 3 blocks from Westbrook Middle School, a coffee cup in hand and a small notebook on his lap. Through his windshield, he watched Travis McCarthy and his friends leaving basketball practice, noting their routes home, their habits, their vulnerabilities. Tuesdays and Thursdays, basketball until 5:30. He muttered, writing in the precise handwriting drilled into him by the Navy. McCarthy walks home alone down Maple Street between 5:45 and 6 o'clock, but the primary target was Harrison Pierce. The history teacher lived alone in a modest ranch house, its paint peeling and garden unkempt. Jack observed him through high-powered binoculars from various vantage points, building a comprehensive picture of the man's routine. 6:30 a.m. Wake up, coffee on front porch 7:15 a.m. Leave for school 4:45 p.m. Return home 6 p.m. Evening walk around the neighborhood 10:30 p.m. Lights out Friday nights were different. Pierce would drive to the landing strip, a rundown bar on the outskirts of town, returning sometime after midnight, often unsteady on his feet. Jack documented everything in his notebook, adding detailed sketches of Pierce's house layout, including the loose window frame in the back bedroom he'd noticed during his nighttime reconnaissance. At home, he maintained normalcy for Lucy's sake. He cooked dinner, helped with homework, tried to coax smiles from her with his terrible dad jokes. But after she went to bed, he retreated to his study, spreading his notes across the desk and refining his plans. One night, as he cleaned his old combat knife, not for use, just maintenance, he told himself. Lucy's voice startled him. "Dad, what are you doing?" He carefully slid the knife into its drawer. "Just some work stuff, sweetheart." "Can't sleep?" She shook her head, hugging herself in her oversized Melbourne Demons football jersey. "Had a bad dream." Jack pushed his notes aside and opened his arms. Lucy curled up in his lap like she used to when she was smaller, when Sarah was still alive. "Want to talk about it?" "It was about Mr. Pierce," she whispered. "He was laughing while Travis and the others—" She trailed off, shuddering. Jack held her tighter, his resolve hardening. "Nothing's going to hurt you anymore, love. Promise. You can't be there all the time, Dad." "No," he agreed, thinking of his plans. "But I can make sure they understand what happens when they hurt my little girl." Lucy looked up at him, searching his face. "What do you mean?" "Just that bullies are cowards, love. And cowards run when someone stands up to them." After Lucy went back to bed, Jack pulled out his notebook again. He opened it to a new page and wrote a single heading. Phase 1. Travis McCarthy. Below it, he detailed his plan. Nothing permanent, nothing that could be traced back to him. Just enough to make the boy understand fear. To make him feel what Lucy felt every day. In the corner of the page, he sketched a small diagram of the route Travis took home from basketball practice, marking the shadowed area between streetlights where the boy would be most vulnerable. Jack leaned back in his chair, running his fingers over his service medals. The Navy had taught him to plan, to be patient, to strike only when everything was perfectly aligned. Those lessons would serve him well now. He picked up his phone and called in sick to work for the next day. Tomorrow would require his full attention. In her room, Lucy slept fitfully, unaware that her father's promise of protection was about to take a form she could never have imagined. And in his small house on Cedar Street, Harrison Pierce went through his nightly routine, not knowing that he'd already been marked for a very personal kind of justice. Jack closed his notebook and checked his watch. In less than 24 hours, Travis McCarthy would learn what real fear felt like. And that would be just the beginning. The space between streetlights on Maple Street created a perfect shadow pocket, a 30-foot stretch of darkness that Travis McCarthy had to cross on his way home from basketball practice. Jack watched from his parked car as the boy approached, basketball under one arm, phone in hand, completely unaware. Jack pulled on his black gloves and checked his watch. 5:47 p.m. Right on schedule. As Travis entered the darkened area, Jack moved. His military training made him silent, efficient. Before the boy could react, a hand clamped over his mouth from behind, another gripping his arm with calculated pressure. "Day, mate," Jack whispered, his Australian accent deliberately thick. "Remember Lucy Blackwood?" Travis's eyes widened in recognition of the accent. Jack could feel the boy's pulse racing beneath his fingers. Scared, Jack tightened his grip slightly. "Good. That's how she feels every day." He spun Travis around, pressing him against a tree. The basketball bounced away into the darkness. "Every single day. Please," Travis whimpered. "I didn't. Toilet water?" Jack's voice remained low, controlled. "Pushing her into lockers? Ring any bells?" Tears streamed down Travis's face. Jack could smell the fear on him, see the dark stains spreading across the front of the boy's basketball shorts. "Here's what's going to happen," Jack continued. You're going to leave Lucy alone. Completely. If I hear about one more incident, one wrong look, one whispered word, I'll be back. And next time, he let the threat hang in the air. I won't touch her. I swear. Travis's voice cracked with terror. Smart lad. Jack released him with a slight push. Oh, and Travis? If you tell anyone about our little chat, if you try to figure out who I am, well, let's just say I know where you sleep. Jack melted back into the shadows, leaving Travis trembling against the tree. From his hidden position, he watched the boy grab his phone and basketball with shaking hands and run home, looking over his shoulder every few steps. Back in his car, Jack removed the gloves and took several deep breaths. The familiar post-operation adrenaline coursed through his system. He'd been efficient, controlled nothing that would leave marks, nothing that could be traced back to him. Just pure psychological terror. The next day at school, Lucy noticed an immediate change. Travis McCarthy, who usually loomed over her at every opportunity, practically ran in the opposite direction when he saw her in the hallway. During lunch, he and his friends sat as far from her as possible, and she could see Travis's hands shaking as he lifted his milk carton. That evening, Lucy seemed lighter at dinner. Travis McCarthy was absent from history class today, she mentioned casually. And at lunch, he wouldn't even look at me. Jack focused on his pasta. Maybe he's finally growing up a bit. Maybe. Lucy studied her father's face. Dad, you wouldn't do anything, would you? Me? Jack gave her his best innocent look. I'm just a boring old security consultant. Remember? But that night, in his study, Jack opened his notebook to a new page. Phase 1 had been successful. Travis McCarthy would never bother Lucy again. Now it was time for Phase 2. He wrote another name at the top of the page. Michael Chun below it, he began sketching out another plan. Each of Travis's friends would receive their own personalized lesson in fear. And after that, Jack's eyes drifted to the final page of his notebook, where a single name waited. Harrison Pierce, but Pierce would require something special. Something that would make him understand exactly what it felt like to be small and powerless in the face of someone stronger. Jack picked up his phone and began researching the landing strip's weekend schedule. Friday nights were about to become very interesting for Mr. Pierce. By mid-November, Jack had systematically worked through Travis's friends. Each encounter was precisely calculated, leaving each boy with enough bruises to remember the lesson, but nothing that would draw official attention. The message was always the same. This is for Lucy, but Harrison Pierce would be different. Jack had spent weeks studying the teacher's routine, noting his Friday trips to the landing strip bar. He wasn't interested in anonymous threats or psychological warfare for Pierce. This would be personal, physical, an eye for an eye. On a cold Friday night, Jack followed Pierce's car from the bar. The teacher lived alone on Cedar Street, in a small house set back from the road. No immediate neighbors, no security cameras. Perfect. Jack parked his car 3 blocks away and walked back, combat boots silent on the wet pavement. His old military backpack contained everything he needed. Black gloves, zip ties, and a first aid kit. Not for Pierce, but in case things got messy. Pierce was fumbling with his house keys when Jack approached from behind. Evening, Mr. Pierce, Jack said softly, his Australian accent thick in the night air. Time we had a chat about my daughter. Pierce turned, squinting in confusion. Recognition dawned on his face just as Jack's fist connected with his solar plexus. Pierce doubled over, gasping for air. Before he could cry out, Jack dragged him inside the house, kicking the door shut behind them. Please, Pierce wheezed, I don't know who I am? Jack's second punch caught Pierce in the ribs. I'm Lucy Blackwood's father. Ring any bells? Recognition and fear flooded Pierce's face. Mr. Blackwood, I can explain. Explain what? Jack threw him against the wall, pinning him there. How you humiliate my 9-year-old daughter. How you encourage others to bully her. Or maybe you'd like to explain why you deleted evidence of abuse from her phone. Pierce's alcohol-dulled reflexes made his attempt to fight back pathetic. Jack easily blocked his wild swing, responding with a precise strike to the teacher's kidney. You see, Jack continued, his voice terrifyingly calm. In the Navy, they taught us about pressure points. He demonstrated on Pierce's shoulder, causing the man to cry out in pain. They also taught us about consequences. For the next 15 minutes, Jack methodically worked Pierce over. Each blow was calculated, designed to cause maximum pain with minimum visible damage. He targeted areas that would hurt for weeks but wouldn't show in normal clothing. "This is for every time you made her cry," Jack said, punctuating each word with a strike. "Every time you called her out in class. Every time you turned a blind eye when others hurt her." When he finally stepped back, Pierce lay curled on his floor, sobbing and retching. "If you ever come near my daughter again," Jack knelt beside him, voice dropping to a whisper, "this will feel like a gentle warning. Understand?" Pierce nodded frantically through his tears. "Good." Jack stood, adjusting his gloves. "Oh, and if you're thinking about reporting this, remember, I know where you live. And next time, I won't be so nice." He left Pierce whimpering on the floor, closing the front door quietly behind him. The night air felt clean in his lungs as he walked back to his car, his hands steady despite what he'd just done. At home, he found Lucy still awake, reading in the living room. "Everything okay, Dad?" she asked, looking up from her book. "You were out late." Jack smiled, his knuckles still tingling under his gloves. "Just taking care of some business, love. Everything's going to be fine now." What he didn't know was that his night of retribution would set in motion events that would force him to choose between protecting his daughter and protecting their future in America. Monday morning arrived with Harrison Pierce notably absent from Westbrook Middle School. His substitute, a nervous young woman fresh from teacher's college, seemed bewildered by the sudden assignment. During lunch period, Lucy overheard whispers in the cafeteria. "Did you see Mr. Pierce's car this morning?" one student murmured. "He could barely walk to it. I heard he was at the landing strip Friday night," another added. "Maybe he got into a fight?" Lucy felt her stomach tighten. She remembered her father's late return that night, the way his knuckles had seemed slightly swollen at breakfast the next day. Part of her had known, deep down, that something was different about Friday night. The following day, Principal Morris's voice crackled over the intercom. Harrison Pierce will be taking an extended medical leave due to injuries sustained in a personal incident. That afternoon, Lucy found Travis McCarthy staring at her in the hallway, his face pale. "Your dad," he whispered as she passed. "It was your dad, wasn't it?" Lucy kept walking, but her heart raced. She thought about the bruises hidden under Travis's sleeve, the way Michael Chun flinched whenever he saw her. The pattern was clear now. At home, she found Jack in his study, methodically cleaning what looked like dried blood from beneath his fingernails. "Dad?" Her voice made him look up sharply. "What did you do to Mr. Pierce?" Jack carefully set down the nail brush. "What makes you think I did anything?" "Please don't lie." Lucy's voice cracked. "I know it was you. With Travis, with Michael. With all of them." For a long moment, Jack said nothing. Then, "Sometimes, love, people need to understand consequences. By beating them up? By giving them exactly what they gave you." Jack's voice hardened. "Eye for an eye." Lucy hugged herself, remembering the bruises, the humiliation, the fear. Did it feel good? Hurting them? No. Jack's honesty surprised her. "But seeing you smile again? That feels good." Before Lucy could respond, blue and red lights flashed through the study window. 2 police cars pulled up outside their house. "Lucy," Jack's voice was calm but urgent. "Go to your room. Whatever you hear, stay there. Dad, now, love." He kissed her forehead quickly. "Remember what I taught you. Blackwoods protect each other." Lucy ran upstairs just as heavy knocking echoed through the house. From her bedroom window, she watched more police cars arrive. She could hear voices below, her father's measured Australian accent, the deeper voices of the officers. Then the sound of handcuffs clicking shut. Through her tears, Lucy watched them lead her father to a police car. He walked with military bearing, head high, showing no resistance. Just before they put him in the car, he looked up at her window and smiled slightly. Only then did she notice Principal Morris's car parked across the street, the woman watching with obvious satisfaction as Jack was driven away. Lucy sat on her bed, her mother's old Melbourne Demons jersey clutched to her chest. She thought about justice, about protection, about the price of standing up to bullies. Her father had taught her that sometimes you had to make the world fair. Now it was her turn. She pulled out her phone and began typing. Dear school board members, I'm writing to tell you about the systematic bullying at Westbrook Middle School and how Principal Morris ignored multiple reports because Blackwoods protected each other. Always. The local newspaper's headline read, Former Australian Navy officer arrested for assault on teacher. Below it, a grainy photo showed Jack being led to a police car, his face composed despite the circumstances. Lucy sat in the kitchen, staring at the article. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from classmates, a mix of fear and newfound respect coloring their words. But she ignored them, focusing instead on her plan. Over the past 3 days, she'd gathered everything. Recordings she'd secretly backed up to the cloud before Pierce deleted them from her phone, dated photographs of her bruises, detailed accounts of every incident she'd reported to Principal Morris. Most importantly, she had emails from other students of victims who'd finally found the courage to speak up after seeing Jack's arrest. The police station was cold when Lucy walked in that afternoon, clutching a thick manila envelope. I'm here to see Detective Sarah Martinez, she announced at the desk, her father's military posture reflected in her straight spine. Martinez turned out to be a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who'd seen enough abuse cases to know victims weren't always who they seemed. Your father assaulted several people, Lucy, Martinez said gently, including a teacher. Yes, Lucy agreed, surprising the detective. He did, because no one else would stop them from assaulting me. She opened the envelope and began laying out her evidence. The photos came first, dozens of them, dated and labeled. Then the backed-up recordings of Pierce's verbal abuse, the threatening messages from Travis and his friends. Finally, copies of every email she'd sent to Principal Morris, along with Morris's dismissive responses. There's more, Lucy said, pulling out statements from other students. 10 other kids came forward. Principal Morris ignored all of them too. One girl even transferred schools because of it. Martinez leaned forward, examining a particularly brutal bruise photograph. Why didn't you show this to the police before? Would you believe a 9-year-old over a teacher with 20 years experience? Lucy's voice was bitter. Principal Morris didn't. The school board didn't. So my dad did what he had to do. For the next 2 hours, Lucy laid out everything: Pierce's systematic abuse, Morris's willful negligence, the school's pattern of protecting bullies over victims. She spoke with a clarity that belied her age, her Australian accent growing stronger as she gained confidence. One more thing, she said, pulling out her phone. I recorded Principal Morris threatening my dad last week. She knew about the bullying. She just didn't care. Martinez listened to the recording, her expression hardening. By the end of the interview, she was making calls to the district attorney's office. That evening, Lucy visited Jack in jail. He looked tired but unbroken. You've been busy, he said, noticing her satisfied expression. Learned from the best, she replied. Detective Martinez says with all the evidence, they might reconsider the charges. Especially since Pierce and Morris broke multiple laws themselves. Jack reached across the table to squeeze her hand. That's my girl. I'm sorry you had to. Don't be. His voice was firm. I'd do it again. Every punch. Lucy nodded, understanding finally that protection sometimes came with a cost. The hearing's tomorrow. Half the school's showing up to support you. Really? Turns out when bullies fall, their victims find their voice. She smiled grimly. Principal Morris isn't going to know what hit her. Jack leaned back, studying his daughter. The scared girl who'd arrived in America just months ago was gone. In her place sat someone stronger, someone who'd learned that justice sometimes required a helping hand or fist. Proud of you, love, he said softly. Lucy gathered her things to leave. Dad, remember what you said about making the world fair? Yeah. Her smile was pure Sarah. Sometimes it takes a Blackwood to do it. The county courthouse buzzed with tension on the morning of the hearing. Lucy sat in the front row, surrounded by a surprising number of Westbrook Middle School students and their parents. Each family had come forward with their own stories of ignored complaints and institutional negligence. Detective Martinez had done her job well. The evidence Lucy provided sparked a broader investigation, revealing years of covered-up incidents under Principal Morris's administration. Pierce's medical records showed his injuries were extensive but non-life-threatening. Exactly the kind of calculated damage a military-trained man would inflict to cause pain without risking death. Jack stood before the judge in his best suit, his posture military straight despite the handcuffs. "Mr. Blackwood," Judge Harriet Shin began, "you stand accused of assault and battery against Harrison Pierce, as well as several counts of intimidation against minors. How do you plead?" "Guilty, Your Honor," Jack replied without hesitation. "I did what I did to protect my daughter. I accept the consequences." The prosecutor rose to speak about the severity of vigilante justice, but was interrupted by a stream of character witnesses and parents whose children had suffered similar abuse, teachers who tried to report Pierce's behavior, even the school janitor who'd witnessed incidents but feared losing his job if he spoke up. Principal Morris sat rigid in her seat as her carefully maintained system crumbled. When the recording of her threatening Jack played in court, her face went pale. Judge Chun listened to all testimony before speaking. "Mr. Blackwood, the law cannot condone taking justice into your own hands." She paused, looking at Lucy. "However, the circumstances here are unique. The system failed your daughter at every level, and as a father, you acted to protect her." She shuffled her papers. "I sentence you to 6 months in county jail, with all but 30 days suspended, plus 2 years probation and mandatory anger management counseling." She turned to the prosecutor. "Additionally, I'm recommending a full investigation into Westbrook Middle School's administration and their handling of abuse complaints." As officers led Jack away, Lucy caught his eye. No words were needed. They both understood the price of justice. 3 weeks later, Lucy stood in the driveway as Jack's taxi pulled up from the county jail. He looked thinner but unbowed, his eyes clear. "Welcome home, Dad," she said, hugging him fiercely. "Good to be home, love." He looked at the house, then at his daughter. "Any trouble while I was away?" Lucy shook her head. "Principal Morris resigned. Pierce isn't coming back to teaching. And Travis McCarthy actually apologized yesterday." "Did he now?" "Fear's a good teacher," Lucy said, echoing his words from months ago. "But you know what's better? Standing up for yourself. You taught me that." Jack studied her face, stronger now, more confident. "Your mum would be proud of both of us," Lucy corrected. That evening, they sat on their back porch, watching the sunset. The newspaper on the table carried the headline, "Westbrook Middle School announces sweeping reforms following abuse scandal." "Was it worth it?" Lucy asked quietly. "The jail time." Jack thought about Pierce's terrified face, about Morris's downfall, about his daughter standing tall in court. Justice always has a price. Love. The trick is making sure the right people pay it. Lucy leaned against him, understanding now what it meant to be a Blackwood. Sometimes protection meant taking a hit. Sometimes justice needed a harsh hand. And sometimes making the world fair meant paying the price together. "Dad?" "Yeah. Thanks for making them scared instead of me." Jack kissed the top of her head, his knuckles still bearing the faint marks of delivered justice. "That's what fathers do, love. That's what fathers do."